We have quite the interesting story. We have a Moroccan national soccer player who also plays for PSG, very popular soccer club or football club. And now he's married, well, they're getting divorced, but he had married a girl. He was 19, she was 31. I believe now he's 24, she's 36. And he had taken his earned income from his money that he was making via soccer and had put all the money in his mom's name. Now, we don't know why he initially put the money in his mom's name. Maybe his mother gave him a forewarning about how you're marrying an older woman and this could potentially end in a disaster, or regardless of age, there's a potential for a disaster, potential for a divorce. So let me safeguard your money. You can still use the money. And just right off the bat, being 19 as a guy, and marrying or dating long-term a girl who's significantly older than you, if your goal is reproduction, you generally want a girl who's younger and fertile, right? So also at the same time, women want a man who's a leader. Women have to find a guy who's generally older than them, 5 to 8 years, that's on average, that's what the stats say. That is the kind of guy who they can look up to and respect because they're an older man. They already have their affairs in order, and that will lead to the most successful marriage or most successful relationship versus the other way around. When you have an older woman and she's dating a younger man, there are exceptions, of course, and one of the exceptions may be this is your only reproductive option. A lot of guys don't have options, so if this is your only option for reproduction, to have children, to start a family, then that's your only option. But this guy, he was on his way, even at 19, to becoming a high-status male in terms of the soccer world, very popular player, as well as earning a higher income, right? So with that opens up a large amount of options. Now, this girl is attractive, of course, so he fell in love with the attraction. He was 19. He may have been naive in many ways. And again, we're speculating with this part. Maybe his mother came in and said, here are some warnings. So this is what we need to do with your earned income. Now, it turns out the woman filed for a divorce 70 to 80% of the time, no matter where you are. Well, it doesn't matter where you are, but mostly in the West, 70 to 80% of the time women file for divorce. And right now we have no-fault divorce. And there is usually community property. So community property in the West means there's a 50-50 even split. Now, generally, women date men who make more than them. So I know a lot of people will say, well, they have to make as much or more, right? Equal or higher. Even if you look at the stats, what's equivalent is actually 58% more. So it's generally, as a guy, you need to earn more for a woman to respect you and to want to be in a relationship with you long term. Are there exceptions? There are exceptions. Generally, as a guy, you need to be the complete package, but in terms of resources, you have to be making more. So guys bring home most of the money most of the time. And in this case, this woman, I'm sure, had her lifestyle paid for. This guy was a high earner in general, and he was probably providing, doing all that. So when she filed for divorce expecting half of his wealth, and she found out all the money was in his mom's name and he had nothing, he had no assets in his name, that was a deal breaker, right? That's a huge shock. Now, I want to contrast this with here in the West, because this is in Morocco, and Morocco is 99% Muslim. So I don't know if it's as strict as Saudi Arabia, for example, but they may have elements of Sharia law, like Islamic law, and that would put the guy at the forefront and protect his property in a stronger manner than we do here in the West. In the West, technically, if we're going by the Constitution, which I mention almost all the time, you have a complete absolute right to life, liberty, and property. There's a whole list of things underneath that, but property is underneath that. Now, in the United States, when you sign a marriage contract and you're a guy, you're getting almost zero benefit. Now, I don't want to go too much into the history of this, but marriage started out as a way to, it was about duty, okay? It was rarely about love. Love started to introduce itself within the past few hundred years, but for the most part of humanity where we had that ritual, that ceremony of two families coming together, it would be both families benefiting from each other, or one family, or just the guy, is benefiting from the other family by taking the daughter, and there's always a trade, right? Sometimes the woman's family gets something in return, like a dowry. That would generally be if the guy is lower status or, not super high status, so he has to provide something to the family. If the guy was extremely high status, sometimes the female side of the family would give a dowry to the guy, or they would just be absorbed by the guy's family because he's in such a high status position that it would benefit the family indefinitely. So That's what it was about. Then duty came along, right? Because you get married to build a family, to have children, and sure, love can be part of that. You build an emotional connection, an emotional bond, and there has to be some attractiveness there. But you're staying together to raise the children, because we know that a two-parent household is what's going to have the most successful outcome in terms of children. This is anywhere you go in the world. And even if we look at ethnicities, ethnic backgrounds, like Indians, for example, in America, have the lowest divorce rate, and they have the highest amount of incomes. So I believe the average income is like 120K for an Indian, and it goes down. It divides itself into, Bangladeshi, then Oriental Chinese, and then you go down, white people, you go down the road. So the culture attributes to how the children are going to be raised, and then the children have a ingrained ideology of how they need to perceive and pursue the world. Now, in the West, a lot of the courts are liberal. So even though, let me go to the marriage contract. You sign a marriage contract as a guy, you really have no benefit other than this is your only option for reproduction. So if a girl is coming in and saying, I want to get married, and you're not a high status male, like most guys are not high status males, this is your only option to have a family. And so you're put into this marriage contract because this is your only accessible point to spread your DNA lineage. If you're a high status guy, there is definitely no benefit. In fact, there's a lot of risk and liability, because now you're risking your assets, you're risking your last name, you're risking a lot more than the woman. The woman is almost never going to bring as much or more assets than you are, because generally they date up, right? So they want a guy who's going to be superior in terms of height, muscle, genetics, intelligence. Like women want a superior guy. That's what this whole situation is about. And guys want an attractive woman who they can replicate with. I brought up this stat before, but only in a generation, only 40 to 60% of men reproduce, and 60% is on the high end, whereas over 80% of women reproduce. So that means most guys, it's like a zero-sum game. Most guys don't end up reproducing. And you compound that over generations, there's a lot more women who exist in your ancestry than men. So it's very difficult for the average guy to actually reproduce. So sometimes they're just settling just to reproduce, just to have their DNA go forward. Now, even when we look at the West and we say, okay, constitutionally, you have a right to property, but now when you sign a marriage contract, you're signing a contract that is really one-sided. In most contracts in the United States, if you have a contract that's one-sided towards one party or another, it won't be enforced by the courts. Yet marriage is a contract that is solely one-sided, and it doesn't even take into account the sexual imperative. What I mean by that is when I mentioned how guys, if that's their only option, then that is their benefit of the marriage. So that's not even taken into account. The courts will enforce a marriage contract, but they won't enforce other contracts that are one-sided. So we can see where the culture is. Now, thanks to birth control, feminism, women now coming to the workplace, I'm not saying we should revoke these. Like, these are, in terms of rights, these are positive notions. But the effect of having all those things in society degrades humanity in a sense that men are given less power, less authority, but still have the same amount of responsibility, because our evolutionary biology is the same, right? We can change all these things within the past 60 years, but women still have a biological preference for certain men, and men still have a biological preference for certain women. And so we can change all these things and have women make a ton more money. I believe in 20, 30 years, women will out-earn men on average. Right now, women are part of middle management the most. Women are in college more so than men. Men work on infrastructure, women work in more social jobs. But we're seeing the shift occur, and what this does is it changes the dynamic between men and women. So even though biologically we're still attracted to the same things, we still have the same hardwiring. Like, a girl can make $100,000 a year, but she still wants a guy who makes $150K a year or more. The hardwiring is still there, even though we can cognitively override the hardwiring. So when we change these dynamics, we end up in a civilization that becomes very disempowering towards men, and it empowers women. And over time, that never really lasts in terms of a proper civilization lasting. You have other civilizations who are, I don't want to say men first, but the men have the lead, and the women are part of that institution. Like, everyone has their roles, right? Like, if you're working in a company, there's a CEO, there's a COO, you have your C-suite executives, you have upper management, middle management, lower management. Now, people can move up and down, but it should be based off of the competence hierarchy. And everyone has a role. Now, just because a guy is in middle management and makes 50K a year and the CEO is at the top and he makes 2 million a year, that doesn't mean that the guy in middle management is a loser or anything, right? If that is his potential, that's his role. If the guy is a CEO and that's his potential, that's his role. Now, if the guy should not be CEO, like he's not competent at all, that's a problem, of course, but everyone has a role, right? And when we look at genders, everyone has a role. Now, men can stay at home and raise the children. Women can go out and work and make $100,000 a year. That's not a problem, but it's not optimal in terms of roles, right? So although we can do these things, we can do each other's roles, it's not optimal. Like I said, it's hardwired in us. This is millions of years of evolution. And that's not to say we may evolve into a different species in the next, 2-3 million years. But as of now, we still have the same programming as we did millions of years ago. If we're just talking about Homo sapiens, 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. So when we look at contracts today, a lot of guys, even if you want to opt out of a marriage contract, there is something called common law. And this is even in conservative states. So common law is you're not overtly, voluntarily signing a contract with the state where there's two parties, the state is in the middle, and you're saying, okay, here's the agreement, even though it's one-sided. You don't even have to sign a contract. The state will intervene itself and say, oh, if you're holding, I'll use Texas for example because I'm in Texas. If you hold yourself to be a married couple, you call each other wife and husband, that's one out of the 3 requirements to being part of common law marriage. If you wear a ring on each other's fingers and you like, there are certain things, right? So even if you just want to have a ritualistic ceremony, you're Jewish, you're Muslim, whatever, and you just have a ceremony without signing a marriage contract, the state can look at that as common law marriage. So the state is intervening itself and automatically prioritizing the woman, because when you are determining that's common law marriage, and by de facto of common law, it is in fact marriage, and then marriage in itself prioritizes women, the state is looking at women as the more prized gender. Now, in general, men are more disposable. Men go to wars, they die the most, they're at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of, I don't want to say the losers of society, but they deal with the most physical, mental catastrophes, the higher suicide rate, all of that. Okay, so men deal with the worst burden of society, the worst that society has to offer. And so naturally, you can produce more sperm than a woman can produce eggs, right? A woman can only get pregnant once per year. A guy can get many girls pregnant just in one shot. So therefore, supply and demand, sperm is cheaper, eggs are more expensive. When we look at what the average guy is viewing, the guys who are viewing this information, they're looking at marriage and they're saying, if I get married, I don't really have any benefit. Even if I put my money into my mom's name, like this soccer player, the court can reverse it. Even though it's my property and I'm putting my money, my earned income in someone else's name to protect my assets because I want to get married, because this is my only option to produce offspring, the court can come in and reverse it and say, oh, you only did that to protect yourself from marriage. Once you get married, whatever income is there, that now is community property. So even the courts will come in and do something unconstitutional. You can't even protect yourself. And in a lot of situations, people get prenups. Prenups only protect your assets before marriage. When you're married, whatever assets are accumulated during marriage, and even then there's a lot of issues, right? Like if you mix funds, or if you put something that was a marital asset and an asset that was yours, if you take a piece of furniture that you had from a rental property and you put it in your house, and the rental property was yours, but you put it in your house and that's a marital asset, now that piece of furniture is considered a marital asset, right? So there's a lot of issues with mixing funds. So no matter how you look at it, men are always they're seeing marriage as a liability, as a risk. Now, that's not to say don't get into relationships. Right? Obviously, you want to find a girl and be able to have offspring and spread your DNA and be compatible with someone, and of course, you both have to vet each other. But the West is making it very difficult because they're giving a ton of rewards to women who don't have to be accountable, and also no-fault divorce. Ronald Reagan, he was a conservative, but he allowed no-fault divorce. And so what that did was, now you're destroying the institution of marriage. Now, I'm not a typically religious guy, but if we look at marriage, they're just like anything else. There are incentives and disincentives. If you create incentives for people to not get married or to file for divorce, because you know on average you're going to be with a guy who's going to make a lot more money, and you can get divorced, you can have a kid, because maybe you want a kid as a woman, and I'm not saying this is an evil, manipulative tactic that women do overtly, although some do overtly. You can get a divorce and of no fault, and then you can keep the house. Let me give an example, just to kind of piss people off. Let's say you're a guy. You have a house, you bought the house, maybe you even bought it while you were married, but you're paying the mortgage, okay? So you're paying all the expenses. And you're with a girl, you care about her, and you come home from work one day and there's another guy there, right, with your girl. And you kick him out, whatever. She can come in, she can file for divorce. She maybe will even give a false domestic violence charge, or maybe not in a bombastic way, but just exercising her feelings or emotions. Law enforcement will come in. Most of the time, they side with the woman because they see the state sees the guy as the aggressor as a default. They will remove you from the house, so the girl will be in the house until everything is settled. And now you don't have your asset, you don't have your girl, and you're out of luck, right? And then you have to go through the whole divorce process, which is just extremely grueling, extremely, grueling is a good word for it, right? You're going through a lot of, I don't want to say heartache, but it's a lot of trauma, frustration. It takes a lot of time away from you, a lot of energy away from you. I would imagine you can't even sleep on some nights because you're just, even if you stop caring about the woman, it's now everything that you've built up to that point, your businesses, your connections, your wealth, all of that is at risk. And so there's a lot of ways that a guy can get ruined just by taking on this risk and liability. So of course you got to vet your woman. But now it comes down to, okay, guys can't even have the ceremonies, they can't even get married. Guys are looking at other nations where they want to go to solve this reproductive problem. These are the passport bros. But even in other nations, if they get married, they're still at risk. Now, like I said, in Morocco and maybe other nations that have Sharia law, you're a little bit more protected as a guy. But in general, guys have to do their due diligence. They have to look out for themselves. Of course, by default, guys want to take care after women and children, right? Like you want to, as a guy, take care of your girl, take care of your family, your kids, and have a productive family. But just make sure when you're getting into that situation, you're aware of everything that could happen, okay? And you're setting yourself up in such a way where if something, no fault of your own, were to occur, you are protected in some way. You may be in a situation where the girl decides, hey, I found a better guy, I'm taking the kids, and most of the time, 80-90% of the time, the girls get custody over the children. Even if you're a much better parent than the girl, unless your wife or your girlfriend, because custody court is separate from marital court, divorce court, right? Whether you're married or not, you're still going to have to go to court for custody. Unless this girl is doing an excessive amount of drugs or something like that, most of the time she will get custody. Now, in some states, it's automatically default split 50-50, but if she pushes it, she would have slightly more leverage. Again, if you're a high-status male, you have a bunch of connections, network, of course, that's a totally different situation, but most guys are not in that situation. Most guys are average, below average. They're dealing with all the possible consequences, negative and positive, mostly negative, of being in a long-term relationship. Now, you should pursue it. This is your biological imperative, but you need to go in it with your eyes wide open. You need to understand the good and the bad, because it is a risk for guys. It's a huge risk, but it's an imperative that guys should feel obligated to fulfill, so you can spread the next generation. You can spread your genes to the next generation. You just have to make sure that you're well protected.